Despite the fact that geopolitics emerged as a scientific approach, from the very beginning it was aimed at explaining the nature of international relations, at finding some laws of international relations and laws of competition between states, and thus very connected with military conflicts and war between states. As we mentioned previously, by the end of the 19th century, there was no more free space in the world to conquer. And thus, international relations and competition between countries had become some sort of zero-sum game, meaning that if you want to add some territories to your own country, you should take them from another country. The First World War had many reasons, and we're not going to find the geopolitical ones. However, the First World War had certain geopolitical consequences that contributed to the further development of geopolitical approaches of some European countries. That's why let's just briefly remind what happened to the European empires. First, the two European and two Asian empires collapsed, meaning the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. In the place where these empires were located, new sovereign states appeared. There were several reasons of why the First World War started, and we are not going to look for the geopolitical ones. However, the First World War had certain very important geopolitical consequences that contributed a lot to further development of geopolitical approaches in various European countries. If before the First World War, geopolitics was considered during the process of foreign policy decision-making, after the First World War, in certain countries, geopolitics became much closer to foreign policy making, and to some extent started to consult the politicians, or the politicians started to use its theories to justify their aggressive actions. First, let's very briefly remind what happened to the European countries. First, we should mention that the two European empires and the two Asian empires collapsed. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. In the region of Eastern Europe, many new small states appeared. However, many of these new European countries were unstable, and Alfred Mackinder was worried that Germany and the Soviet Russia could spread their influence in the region. That is why he suggested to construct an effective security system for Eastern Europe and to make a strategic buffer of independent states between Germany and Soviet Russia, and thus to limit geographical access of both Germany and Soviet Russia to this region. Geopolitically, it was aimed at limiting power of Germany and the Soviet Russia. However, the triumphant states, Great Britain, France, and the United States President Woodrow Wilson, did not consider all these geopolitical factors. Instead, they proposed the so-called liberal approach to international relations. They believed that the only way to avoid any further conflict is to get rid of secret diplomacy and to establish the common security system for the whole European region. There was a romantic idea that these steps would allow to the European countries to avoid any future conflicts. The fact that this idea did not work is usually associated with the personality of the German geopolitical thinker Karl Haushofer. Karl Haushofer, a geographer and retired general, saw geopolitics as a solution to many of the Germans' post-war difficulties. In this map, we can see that as a result of the First World War, the territory of Germany shortened, it lost many of its territorial possessions, and different parts of the country were even divided. Karl Haushofer was to some extent a follower of the ideas of Friedrich Ratzel, meaning that he tried to continue his traditions of Geopolitics. In his book Why Geopolitics, Haushofer claimed that the reason Germany lost World War I was because its leaders did not study geopolitics. As he said, Geopolitics is one of the most powerful weapons in the struggle for a more just distribution of vital spaces of the Earth. Thus, Karl Haushofer tried to use geopolitics based on traditions of Friedrich Russell and Halford Mackinder, and to give certain suggestions to the German politicians of how to overcome the post-First World War difficulties. It is hard to find the certain moment when the transition from Haushofer's Geopolitik to the Nazi geopolitics happened. Maybe we can start with friendship between Karl Haushofer and Rudolf Hess, who was Adolf Hitler's deputy. Via Hess, Karl Haushofer even met Adolf Hitler in 1923 and had a chance to share some of his ideas, including the idea of Lebensraum, the concept which was first developed by Friedrich Russell. Since nations were competitive organic entities, according to the Russell's theory, that gained their power from the soil, the German nation that lacked this territory and resources could begin pursuing Lebensraum or else face decay and further decline. As long as nations were competitive organic entities, according to the Russell's theory, that gained their power from the soil, there were two ways for the Germany to continue its history. The first one, to pursue its Lebensraum, or else to face decay and further decline. Despite the fact that Nazi geopolitics emerged from Haushofer's Geopolitik, there were certain very important distinctions between these two concepts. For example, Haushofer's Geopolitik advocated for economic collaboration between Germany and the great open spaces of the Soviet Union. In contrast, Nazi Geopolitik was oriented on Eastern policy in the sense of acquiring the necessary soil for the German people. Another distinction was that Haushofer considered British Empire as the ultimate enemy of Germany. For Adolf Hitler, a crusade against the Soviet Union and the Jewish Bolshevism was the main goal. For Karl Haushofer, the Russo-German alliance of 1939 was aimed at enabling Germany to be independent and self-sufficient. From the point of view of Adolf Hitler, this could be achieved only through colonization of the East by the renewed German Empire. The German race was to enslave the subhuman Slavs of the East, according to his book Mein Kampf. It was also the opposite view on the ultimate determinant of national destiny. For Haushofer, it was space, not race, while for Adolf Hitler, race was in the first place. Karl Haushofer tried to defend the German geopolitics, or Geopolitik. He said that the borderline was easily crossed between the pure science and practical science, and therefore it happened that he occasionally overstepped those borders. He also said that all that was written and printed after 1933 by himself was under pressure and should be judged accordingly. He also said that in the Third Reich in Germany in 1930s, the party in power, the Nazi Party, wrongly understood and wrongly used many of his geopolitical concepts. But in the end, it was this period in the history of development of geopolitical thought that it started to be associated strongly with the aggressive policy, in this case of the Nazi Germany, and thus was blamed by many other political scientists, thinkers, philosophers, and public in general. All in all, there were three main attacks on geopolitics. First, it was blamed to be responsible for war and aggression in the end of 19th and the first half of the 20th century. Second, it was blamed for being not a pure science. Instead of proved causalities, geopolitics provided justification of foreign policy, which was far from the real social sciences. Finally, there was a very huge pressure on geopolitics from the other mainstream IR approaches. German geopolitics was used to justify oppressive European colonial empires, ideas of white supremacy. It was quite understandable that Karl Haushofer, who was the author of many German geopolitical theories, tried to defend something that he had created. However, the things were done by the Nazi Party and the Nazi geopolitics. And it was 1930s when geopolitical thought started to be associated with war, with conflict, with aggressive behavior of the German state. And that brought certain problems to the whole geopolitical approach.